Hey, good evening, Castlers. We are continuing the coverage of the 2022 Independence Day Tournament. This evening's matchup is between the Bronze Brickhouse, also known as Juanitamann, from Flatbush, Brooklyn, going up against the Orangutan, also known as Warpathhunter from YO. That's Yonkers, New York, if you don't know. Juanita is the lone female still competing in this tournament. Let's get to the game. Juanita starts out with pawn to d4. Warpath counters with pawn to e5, the England gambit again. Juanita takes, then Warpath plays knight c6. Juanita now leads by one material point. Bishop f4 defending the attack pawn. Pawn to d6 puts pressure on the e5 pawn. Juanita takes, then takes, equal exchange. Juanita then plays pawn to e3. Bishop f5 puts pressure on the c2 pawn. Pawn to c3 blocks the attack. Queenside castle, knight to f3. Knight f6, Warpath connects his rooks. Bishop to b5, bishop to d7. Juanita then castles kingside. Pawn to h6, knight b to d2. Juanita now connects her rooks. Knight e5 presents a discovered attack on the bishop on b5. Juanita takes with the check on the king. Warpath recaptures with his knight rather than the king, which was the better move. Knight takes e5 by Juanita. Warpath recaptures with his knight. Rook f to d1. Excellent move from Juanita, hoping to reveal some discovery attacks later on down the line with the removal of her knight. King to c7 is played by the orangutan. You then get pawn to b4, pawn to g5, pawn to f4, g takes f4, e takes f4, equal trade, plus you're attacking the more valuable knight. Knight g4 moves it to safety, knight to f1. Warpath grabs the open file with his d-rook, excellent move. Pawn to h3 kicks the knight away to f6, knight g3, rook g8 hits the knight. King to h2 defends it. Rook to e3 puts pressure on the g3 knight and c3 pawn simultaneously. But the Bronze Brickhouse solves that problem by playing the great move of knight f5. This girl can play. Rook takes c3. Warpath snatches the pawn and erases the 1 point material deficit. Rook d to c1. Juanita looking to trade rooks and win the game in the endgame. She definitely sees the light at the end of the tunnel. Warpath obliges, takes with check. King d7 moves the king to safety. Juanita then proceeds to grab the free pawn on h6. She now leads by one material point again. Good job. Warpath regroups and plays rook g7, defending the attacked f7 pawn. Knight f5 hits the rook. Rook h7 moves it to safety. King g3, knight e4 check. King f3 attacks the knight. Knight d2 check. King to e3 traps the king. That knight now has no safe squares to land. What is the orangutan going to do? He plays the best move, king to e6, that's what. Going after her knight, good job. Juanita takes the knight. Warpath takes the knight. Then you get rook to c4. Rook h4, putting pressure on the f4 pawn. King e3 defends it. Pawn to d5 attacks the rook. Juanita simply plays rook to d4, now attacking the pawn and threatening a check on the king. Rook h6, rook takes d5 check. Juanita takes the free pawn and goes up by two material points. King to e6 attacks the rook. You then get rook to d3, king f5, king f3, rook c6, g4 check, king e6, f5 check. King e7, rook e3 check, king f8, king g3, king g7, pawn to a4, rook c4 attacks the unguarded b4 pawn, rook b3 defends it, pawn to f6, king h4, pawn to a6, pawn to a5, king f7, king to h5, king g7, pawn to h4, rook e4, pawn to b5, rook e5, b takes a6, and b takes a6, equal trade of pawns, rook b7 check, king f8, King G6. Rook takes A5. Warpath takes the free pawn. Juanita takes the free pawn and simultaneously creates a checkmate threat with Rook B8 checkmate on her next move. Warpath missed the mate threat and played Rook A1 when, let's go back here, when Rook B5, let's play Rook B5 here. When Rook B5 was the best move. It's losing, but it prevents mate. So going back to the actual move, we played Rook to A1. Juanita then played Rook B8 checkmate on her next move and claimed the orangutan as a notch on her belt. Game over. So a very smooth game played by the bronze Brickhouse. She took advantage and never let it go. Currently, let's look at the leaderboard. Currently, Juanitamann is in second place with 7 points in Group 2. As you can see right here. And Warpathhunter is in 7th place with 3.5 points accumulated. Remember, only one player can advance to the finals from each group. Who will it be? Well, that remains to be seen. That's going to do it for tonight. I'm Eladef07 saying stay tuned, and I'll see you soon.